Well, greetings everyone from PERC at the University of Florida in Gainesville. We hope that you are all safe and healthy wherever you find yourselves this morning. And welcome to our next session in our Next Practices series. As we've been mentioning throughout, as we're dealing with this crisis across the globe, there really isn't anyone that's figured out this is what we should be doing. This is how we should be handling this, adapting to this. This is what things are going to look like after the crisis has passed. So we've been checking in with folks in different sectors, in different parts of the globe to find out what's happening. And what are some of the things that utilities and consumers and regulators and governments are doing in order to deal with the crisis? And today, we're happy to be joined by Silvia Alvarado de Co. And Silvia is going to fill us in on what's happening in the Latin American power sector. So without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Silvia and start out by asking, so within the context of the power sector in Latin America, what's happening? How are we dealing with this crisis? And what are some of the things that folks should know?
Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks, Ted, for the kind introduction. And as always, many thanks for inviting me to join you guys at PERC. Group that I admire so much, and I'm glad that you're doing this to promote the exchange of opinions among colleagues in these challenging times that we're also faced to live with. Rebecca, if I can have my first slide, please. I prepared a couple of slides for you, my dear colleagues, to try to summarize what we are seeing our governments and populations are doing here in terms of the power sector. As we know, and as many other countries, every other countries in the world are doing, mandatory lockdowns have been put in place, and that is creating a major disruption in the regular business of the power sector. Of course, as a sector that has to recover its costs, the payment change within the sector is a big concern to everybody that participates in this important strategic activity. We are also seeing that there are demand drops, of course. People are locked in their homes, and a lot of the industries are suspended. It's just those that are considered essential, like food supply, drug supply, and fuel supply activities are being kept. But a lot of the commercial activity is locked down as well, is shut down. Therefore, we are experiencing demand drops that were very sensitive since the very first days, of course. Quarantines is also the common factor in all of our countries. We are being asked to stay home. And we are, in many countries, we are being granted the chance to get out to do very essential stuff like buying our groceries and stuff like that, but it's very minimum. So the power demand has decreased, at least for what I've seen in our neighboring countries and in my own country, Guatemala, from 10 to 15% at least. It might be higher depending on the level of industrialization of each country, of course. And there is the concern that the slow down of commercial and industrial activities will jeopardize sooner or later the payment chains of that are key to the functioning of our sectors. And for those countries that have open markets, deregulated markets, we are also concerned that large users like industries, hotels, ports, airports will be have been already directly affected by the shutdown of their activities. And we wonder if they will keep their ability to pay for power supply. So this is more or less the scenario. And this is the challenge we have in front of us at this moment.
So, Silvia, what are the types of things that the utilities and the governments are doing to adapt to some of these changes? You know, you mentioned the security of the supply chain, and are there special things that the utilities and governments are doing to try to shore up that security?
Sure, of course. The next slide, please. The second challenge we have is also the oil prices crash, and that from the consumer point of view is positive, but from the producer's point of view, it's a challenge as well. So in my current activity as advisor to some governments and some of the industry members as well, what I'm looking at is a very genuinely desire of the industry and of the governments to put in place measures to help consumers, but also on the other side to help producers. So the next slide, please, Rebecca. So my main concern these days is that we all hope that this crisis is going to be in place for the shorter time possible. We are hoping, all of us, for that. But we don't, the truth is, we don't know what's gonna happen, how long it will be in place. And what we're seeing is that, to me, one of the most challenging situations is that politicians may be tempted to put in place some measures that may damage for a more permanent basis our markets, if I want to call it that way. What I'm trying to say is all of the governments are concerned about the ability of customers to pay their electricity bills, their monthly electricity bills. So some of them, it varies from country to country, but some of them have already mandated a freezing of the collections, or a suspension of those collections, or a deferring those collections and stuff like that. And what I think is that in those countries that we have, our markets are open and the industry is in charge of providing this strategic service, the best thing would be that the own industry comes out with proposals to address the situation rather than imposing measures that would damage the sustainability of the sector. But of course, that's our main, that will be our main desire or aspiration, but that's not what's going on. So where are the authorities of the power sectors, their regulators, what they have to deal with these pressures from the political sectors to help the consumers in detriment of producers. And I think the producers are willing to help, but of course, it's a matter of where the money is coming from for sustaining the activities. And what I propose in this slide is that legal certainty, in my opinion, should be kept as to the maximum extent possible. So in other words, going to Congress to modify regulatory frameworks for a situation that we'll hope is a short-term situation, or is going to be resolved in a matter of months, or hopefully less than a year or so, going to Congress and modifying regulatory frameworks to protect consumers is not going to protect them in the long run, as we know, because the best protection for consumers is that there is supply and competition. And if we, through government interventions or legal interventions, we want to keep things like frozen, is not going to work. So what I'm proposing here is that we identify, all of us who work on the regulatory side, on the industry side, we identify some alleviation measures that we can propose to consumers and to our governments, and to soften or to manage the crisis while it lasts. And that could be differing tariff mechanisms. I know that many regulatory frameworks have that ability. You can sit down with the operators and look for, within your regulatory framework, what can you do to defer some payments, finance the payments for the most pressuring months, and defer the payments towards the end of a period, for instance. Subsidies are also going to be needed. In fact, in Central America, most of the countries have a mechanism to subsidize low-income consumers. And the best way to do it would be direct subsidies to those consumers, not to the consumption in general, but to those low-income consumers needed. So distribution operators have very good databases, geo-referenced databases that can allow you to identify those low-income consumers that are in need of a higher subsidy level during this challenging period, and hopefully maximize the use of your fiscal revenues during this time, because that is another issue that you're going to be facing at the same time. Fiscal revenues are going to be dropping because economic activity is decreased as well. So it's certainly not an easy time, of course, we know, but my main message to participants in this conference is, let's look for the best way to carry out the situation without affecting legal certainty.
Silvia.
Because after the crisis is over, all of our countries, yes, hold on, yeah.
No. Silvia, I just want to take you back for just a second. You talked about, Guatemala has an open wholesale market, so you have competitive power suppliers. You talked before about, the consumer end of deferring payments, but then you also talked about some of the producers being willing to work with the utility, work with the government on their end. So who started those talks with the power suppliers? Was that something where the government approached the power suppliers, or was it the distribution company, the grid operator? Who started that dialogue?
Well, it's a combination, it's when the industry is looking at a situation where the politicians want to take decisions that may affect the sustainability of their business. What I've seen is that most of that industry members are willing to come up with proposals, you see, and it's happening all over. The industry is smart, knows its business, and is willing to contribute, to look for short-term measures. But my point is, if you modify your regulatory framework and you impose measures that are against the full recovery of costs in the long run, you're going to be having a lot of trouble later on when you want or you need to, when you're in need to reactivate your economy. You will find yourself with an industry that is depressed and not recovering costs, and that will be a larger issue than what you were trying to address at the beginning. So I think there's a lot of willingness from the industry to come up with proposals everywhere I see.
Oh, terrific. I've actually got a couple more questions, but I noticed the questions are starting to back up in the queue. So I actually want to get to some of the participants' questions. The first one from Ram in Nepal you talked earlier about the decrease in demand as a result of the crisis. Ram was asking, so who's then responsible for balancing the grid, for deciding which power producers are going to be cut back, and then something I would add for myself: how does that influence the present, or how is that influenced by the presence of any take-or-pay contracts that you might have for power production?
Well, I think that the ideal situation for me is that you go back to your market rules, and your market rules regularly establish how you will dispatch power vis-a-vis demand. And the fact that demand is diminishing, depending on how strong it drops, may force you to sit down with people and look for short-term alternatives. But my recommendation is you do it in a very participatory way, in a very transparent way, openly, and respecting the regulatory principles of your legal framework. In other words, if you have a legal framework, like is the case in most of Latin American countries, that respects the economic dispatch of units, you follow that throughout the crisis as well. And regularly producers are well covered through their contracts with their customers. But if there is an excess power, you will have to see how you spread out the consequences, the economic consequences of that.
Okay.
To all the market. Quite frankly, I believe that we haven't seen, at least in our region, the need for not respecting the market rules, and hopefully we won't see it, because to me that's the core of the functioning of the market.
I've got questions from Sydney and Patrick on consumer angle, but before I get to that, while we're on talking about power supply contracts, Eileen from the Philippines brought up a question talking about in Morocco's case in the Philippines, invoking force majeure clauses in the power contracts. Have you seen the use of force majeure as a way to maybe relax some of the constraints that the power supply contracts are imposing?
I would assume that there is the chance that some agents may try to use that, but look what, in my opinion, this is not going, hopefully won't be a very sustained situation. Hopefully it will be a short-term crisis. If you start jeopardizing your market through triggering legal mechanisms like those. Later on, when you want to restore your market, you're going to be in trouble, and it most probably won't be a solution, because under these circumstances, everybody can argue that they did what they had to because they didn't have any choice, you see? So my recommendation is, if someone is trying to enforce force majeure situation, I would doubt it's from the producer's side, maybe on the operator's side. But I would recommend try to avoid that, just because, as I say, those legal disputes are very long, are very unproductive to both sides. And in the end, nobody really wins under those circumstances. I haven't seen around that situation yet, because, as I said, the demand drop that we're seeing is not as huge as to create that kind of circumstance or mess for the power market. But that of course can be an element of how our demand is structured here, because most of the industries, some of the industries are not working, but a lot of them, because we are countries that we produce a lot of food and essential goods, a lot of them are still working. So the drop in demand is not as significant to create that kind of disruption scenario, I think. Not yet, gladly.
Okay, then we got a couple of questions on the consumer side. Patrick was asking about the deferral of payments from the consumers and that role in helping the consumers recover. So you've already talked about the cash flow from the standpoint of the consumer, cash flow from the standpoint of the power producers. Is there one segment that we might consider more critical or more important than another? And the idea behind the deferral of payments for the consumers is going to help the consumers recover. So that's a good thing, right?
Yes, it is indeed. And if you see that most of the countries are approving emergency economic packages at the level of their Congress. And these packages include financing that the operators can tap into to help their users, their consumers, with payment deferral. In many countries here, there is the payment deferral mechanism included in the regulation when there is a very drastic change in the costs, for instance, for your tariff. That recognize some interest payment to the operator, so that they are, nobody is going to lose, you see. So it's, in finance, if you take a financing approach, you can work it out, I think. But the main recommendation is, as we have discussed many times, this is a sector that if doesn't have full cost recovery, is not sustainable. So keep that in mind, and try. I know it's hard because politicians don't like to think on the long run. They just want quick results. But try to work out with your key politicians, making them understand that this strategic sector needs full cost recovery, or it's not sustainable.
Thank you. Sydney asked a question regarding, you talked earlier about the fact that fuel prices have come down. So how quickly are reductions in fuel costs passed through to customers? And if those reductions aren't passed through quickly, don't some of those revenue imbalances work themselves out because consumers are paying tariffs based on old fuel prices, as fuel prices come down, the company's costs are less. So don't some of those imbalances work themselves out?
Yes, definitely. I think in most of the regulatory regimes, you have tariff adjusting mechanisms that that at the most in a quarter of the in 3 or 4 months, you pass through your fuel costs and your energy purchases cost to your tariffs, and definitely it will reflect very quickly in the tariffs to end users and will help the situation. On the other hand, as we know, if the generation price really comes drops too much, it comes to a level that is, but that's a different problem. In the medium and long run, it will be an issue for price signals to the market and new investments. But for the short term, it will help. And that's another important thing that we have colleagues here in the Central American region that were tempted, their politicians were tempted that when they saw the oil crash, they said, okay, we are going to shut down our purchases to renewables because that's expensive energy and we want to privilege thermal generation. And they were trying to disrespect rules and change legal regimes to do that, to get a very short-term gain to consumers. And I say that because once you do that, you don't respect investments. It's hard to get back credibility for new investments. So they were trying to do it, and well, gladly, they realized that the oil prices crash was not going to be that sustainable either, and that they were not going to gain much by just having a couple of months of very low prices in their tariffs, and then depending again on very volatile and high prices of oil, because we all know, well, nobody knows how high those prices will go back, but we all know that they're not going to remain as they are right now. So that's another message to them. You shouldn't be tempted by very short-term signals to make decisions that later on you're going to regret.
Okay, sticking with the support angle, Alagi asked the question that sometimes direct payments to customers can be cumbersome, can be difficult for the government. High transaction costs. Government has to find all the different people to distribute money to. What about direct subsidy to the operator? You know, it's a lot easier to find. You know where the operator is. You're basically making one payment instead of a whole bunch of little ones. Do you see any challenges with providing the government subsidies in that manner?
Well, I guess it depends on how your low-income consumers, how much they are in each country. Because if you give the money to the operator, but it's not targeted to low-income consumers, you may end up subsidizing people that can afford the full cost of electricity, even during this crisis. So I think you can do it, but you should limit the amount of kilowatt hour per capita or per month that those people consume, so that subsidy is targeted towards low-income consumers. Because if you do it in a wide way, you will end up subsidizing people like you or me or everybody in this video conference who can afford to pay its electricity bill, thanks God. So we don't need a subsidy. And so that's the challenge when you are establishing or defining a subsidy, what database you use and what mechanism you use to channel the money to consumers. For instance, I don't know if you guys saw, but in El Salvador, our neighboring country here, there was a huge issue because the president offered $300 per user, not just for electricity, but as a subsidy for the difficult time, $300 per month. And he wasn't aware all those people were in the informal sector, and there was not going to be a way to channel that money to them. And there were lines, huge lines. The next day, it was huge lines in the streets of people begging or people demanding their $300. And rather than keeping the pandemic under control, it was a very risky day. He had to put the army in the street to put all those people back to their homes. So one idea that my country is using, and I think is going to work out well, is that they targeted those consumers under 200 kilowatt hour per month or less. The distribution operators have databases that have those consumers well identified, and they are going to receive a transfer, a money transfer through their mobile phones. So that way they can go to an ATM cashier and get the money out of that cashier. And that's a more ordered way to get the money, to say. So you have to be creative, and it depends on each country. How much information you have on consumers, it makes a huge difference, because the more you have them identified, the easier it's going to be to channel the resources to them.
Okay. All right. We have, there are still a couple of follow-ups, but actually, Rebecca, do we want to reach out to folks directly to see if they'd like to pose their follow-ups? I know Eileen had a follow-up to the force majeure that addressed some of the concerns that Silvia had with that process. And then Ram had a follow-up to his question as well.
Yes, I think that we can do that. Ram, are you available? I can unmute your audio.
Hello.
Are you there? Hi, Ram.
Hello. Good morning. Hi. Good morning. Good evening. Let me show you my face also. I actually, because of the lockdown, I have, grown up my beard also. I don't know whether you recognize me or not. I just wanted to ask you, actually, I'll be sharing you one paper tomorrow. The newspaper is going to publish, especially on power crisis and the COVID thing. So this will be shared to you tomorrow. And the one actually follow-up question to Silvia is the power producers, because of the supply problem, because of the movement restrictions, so they have not been able to actually mobilize their own team. But still, the project is generating power, and the utility is saying, no, I don't need your power because of conflict of interest. We have kind of vertically integrated utility. So we got a 2-page long, letter requesting us to intervene in that area. The whole idea was to, you are a kind of, independent regulator. You need to, listen our voice also. And then we suggested, we are now recommending to utility that you please give them a kind of, flat lump sum amount, and when situation becomes normal, then you adjust the payment. This is slightly different than the deferred payment. Deferred payment is for consumer side utility, whereas now we are saying this for the power producers. So I don't know whether this is a good move, because politicians now, they are saying we are going to give 25% discount on the energy price. The utility is saying no, that has to come from from the government's own source. This is you cannot dictate us. You should not ask us to use our own fund. Whereas politicians, the ministry is saying no. You are a state-owned utility. You need to actually follow our instruction, and we are very new. So here, I'm not sure whether our approach is in right direction or not. So in this case, I'm preparing a case. I'll share you tomorrow, but still I just wanted to hear from Silvia on this.
So Sylvia, have you had a situation where some of the power producers are saying, hold on, we should be producing? You know, it's not fair to cut us back.
Of course, because as in every other business, the economy of a business is based on projections and projected revenues and so on. And nobody wants to be curtailed or be told, you know, this month we are going to just buy 50% from you and not the regular 100% supply that we regularly buy from you. I guess it depends on how you structure your PPAs with those producers. If you really don't respect those PPAs, you're going to find yourselves in a big trouble in a very short time frame. Because in my experience, the industry is is very, they know very well their business, and they are going to defend their interest in the best way possible. Having said that, I think this is an outstanding emergency that none of us ever were through something like this. And we have to call everybody for awareness and for collaboration spirit and for looking for the best alternatives that will harm the less everybody else. And but you can do that if you are in a transparent way, in a negotiated way, and rather than being too mandatory and imposing bans and imposing freezing of tariffs and things like that. Because in the short term, it will, of course, they will obey. But later on, you're going to find yourselves with a lot of legal suits and legal issues because you didn't respect the commitments that you had under those PPAs. And I guess that takes us back to the force majeure our colleague was mentioning. Nobody knows in an arbitration court 2 or 3 years from now, how would arbitrators rule on a situation like this, you know? Because it's a humanitarian emergency. And we have to, as long as we keep that in mind, we are going to be safer. In other words, what I'm trying to say is, it's not a shortfall of cash because there was some financial crisis somewhere or just the oil prices crash. It's nothing like that. Now, these days, the main concern is people's health. And governments can always argue that they are using the revenue to protect. That's the primary concern. Everything else is like a complement or like a secondary thing. And the good thing on electricity, though, is that in order to provide healthcare to people, you need electricity in most of cases. So you can also balance those things. You can also make politicians aware that it's not a luxury kind of good or service that you're talking about. It's an essential service. Be also careful with that, because when you bring that argument to the table, people might be tempted to say, no, because it's an essential, a human right, I am going to intervene it, and I am going to declare emergency, and I'm going to respect any rights and any function. So it's a balance. And I think on the side of the industry, there is awareness that this is a humanitarian crisis, and there is that awareness. People are smart in our industry. So I believe that if you're transparent and you try to work out a scheme that respects as much as possible within the context you're dealing with, but you're trying to respect as much as possible the rights of everybody, they will appreciate that, and they may will to cooperate with you and to be in a cooperative mood to work out things. But if you just enforce or impose things to them, they're just going to say, okay, I'll see you in a court. And you know, it is how it is.
Thank you, Ram. And by the way, the grown out beard looks good. A follow-up though from Eileen. It is in the contract in the Philippines that allows them to declare the force majeure provision. So if you kind of take the legal fight out of the equation and the possibility of an arbitrator ruling against you in 2 or 3 years, do you have the same concerns over now basically exercising a provision that already existed in the PPA?
I believe, Ted, that it depends on what you're trying to solve. Let me explain myself. If obeying those rules and respecting those provisions and everything, you are able to deal with the situation in an acceptable manner, you just do it. Because it's my message to you guys is, you try to preserve your markets and your legal regimes and all the rules under which you operate regularly. Try to preserve them as much as possible. I know it's very difficult with politicians. I know it is. But you should work with your presidents, prime ministers, authorities, and they regularly understand this is a strategic sector. They don't want to jeopardize such a strategic sector for a short-term crisis. They want to preserve it working and available for the recovery, because in a few months we are going to be struggling with recessions, and we will need our power sectors in good shape. And if we destroy them on the basis of this emergency, it is just going to make it worse. And when you have to deal with recovery.
Okay, that leads me to my last question. You've touched on it already, but I want you to, if there's anything that you have to add, I'd love to hear it. Once the crisis is passed, how do you see, if at all, the Latin American power sector changed by this crisis?
I think that they say every crisis is an opportunity, and maybe there will be efficiency improvements. There will have to be, because you're going to be operating under a scenario of lower demand, of lower revenues, and lower efficient. Hopefully you won't lose the long-term vision. That's one of my concerns, that people
Let's give it 1 second, Ted, and see if she's able to get logged back in.
Okay.
And then in the meantime, you do have the option in the participant box to raise your hand if you would like to share your own experience while we're waiting to get Silvia back on. Please do raise your hand, or you can direct a message to to me in the chat, and I'll be happy to unmute your audio. You do not have to share your video unless you would like to.
Yeah, I think Silvia had a lot of very important insights on, how we're maintaining the system as we go forward. Some of the challenges that we have in dealing with the day-to-day needs of not only the customers, but every aspect of the supply chain, and how some of that is prioritized and some of the difficulties in prioritization. Certainly everybody likes to see a situation where, the challenge that I'm dealing with is the most important one. And this idea that someone has to take the initiative and say, well, no, we have to prioritize. And I think it looks like we have Silvia back. Her microphone is.
Yes, I'm back.
Ah, great.
Don't you hear? Can you hear me?
I can, yes, thank you.
No, thank you, and sorry for that, guys. Okay, just to finish the idea, I think that we will have to we'll have to be creative, and we'll have to work with the industry in our countries. That's my recommendation. Try to make them aware of the emergency requires a lot of cooperation and flexibility and willingness to help. Because if we don't do it, we're going to be with measures that they're going to harm our business for a longer period. I think it's not easy because profitability is to be kept in those countries where the market is unregulated, and in those that are still vertically integrated, the main temptation is, guys, you just eat all your losses now and we'll deal with them later on. And the problem is later on never comes, and you start carrying out deficits, and you start deferring investments and the quality of service. We, in our work as advisors or regulators or government people, our main responsibility is the user, the consumer, and quality of service, affordability of that service, competitive service, and all those goals. Right now, they're like in a basket, just waiting for the times to go back to normal. But let's always think or remember that all of those goals won't be achievable if we sacrifice the health of our markets for the long run. So I think it's that's the challenge we have in front of us, to work with our authorities and our politician colleagues to make them understand that it's not magic. I mean, as I say, I always repeat, this is an industry that needs full cost recovery. In the meantime, if you want to use your government revenues to afford those costs, that's your legitimate right and decision. And that is something that is definitely for consideration, but it's not sustainable. It's just a short-term measure.
Well, thank you very much, Silvia, for all of your critical insights into the power sector in Latin America and how it is adjusting to this crisis and what it may look like when the crisis is hopefully passed as quickly as possible. And so thank you very much for your time, for your insights. Thank you to everyone for the time you've chosen to share with us today. We hope that you stay healthy. We hope that you stay safe. And we hope to see you again very soon. Thank you all very much.